During World War II, millions of soldiers were taught how to fight, how to march, and how to survive. But they were never taught how to write honestly about fear. Publicly, soldiers were expected to be confident. Letters home were often censored. Official reports focused on success, movement, and morale. Yet in private, many soldiers turned to diaries. These were not written for commanders, historians, or future generations. They were written at night, in silence, often by tired hands shaking from exhaustion. Diaries became a place where soldiers could say what they could not say aloud. From 1941 to 1945, soldiers on all sides, American, German, British, Soviet, kept private records of their days. Some wrote daily, some only when the weight became too heavy. What they wrote rarely matched the heroic image of war. Many diary entries spoke not of glory, but of confusion. Not of bravery, but of fear that never seemed to go away. Fear before battle. Fear during silence. Fear of surviving when others did not. Unlike letters, diaries were not meant to reassure anyone. They did not need to sound strong. A soldier could admit that he was scared, that he hated the noise, that he did not understand why he was still alive. American soldiers, especially those arriving in Europe in 1944, often wrote about shock. Not at the enemy, but at the reality of combat. Training had not prepared them for the constant tension, the waiting, the uncertainty. German soldiers, particularly after 1943, wrote about exhaustion and doubt. Many no longer believed in victory. But they continued to fight because stopping felt impossible. What makes these diary entries powerful is not what they describe, but why they were written. These soldiers did not believe their words would survive. Many assumed the diaries would be destroyed, lost, or forgotten. That freedom allowed honesty. Some entries are short, a few lines written quickly before sleep. Others are longer, almost desperate, as if the writer needed to empty his mind onto the page. Across different armies and fronts, the themes repeat. Fear of the next day. Anger at orders that made no sense. Guilt over surviving. Numbness after too much violence. These were not thoughts meant for history books. In fact, many soldiers would have been uncomfortable knowing these diaries would later be read. They were personal, unfiltered, sometimes contradictory. A soldier could write about hatred one day and pity the next. About courage in the morning and fear at night. That contradiction is what makes these diaries valuable. They remind us that soldiers were not symbols. They were people trying to hold themselves together in an environment designed to break them. After the war ended in 1945, many of these diaries were found by families. Some were published years later. Others remain private. But together, they reveal a version of World War II that official history rarely shows. Not the war that was planned. Not the war that was celebrated. But the war that was endured. And to understand what soldiers truly experienced, we must begin here. With the words they never expected anyone to read. Fear was the most common word written in World War II diaries. Not the dramatic fear shown in films, but a quieter one, persistent, exhausting, and impossible to escape. Many soldiers wrote that fear did not disappear with experience. It simply changed shape. Before their first battle, fear was sharp and immediate. After weeks or months at the front, it became constant background noise. Something that never fully left. American soldiers arriving in combat zones during 1943 and 1944 often wrote about the shock of anticipation. They described nights where sleep was impossible, not because of gunfire but because of imagination. The mind filled the silence with possibilities. Some wrote that the waiting was worse than the fighting. German soldiers, especially after 1942, described a different kind of fear. For them, fear was mixed with inevitability. They wrote about knowing an attack was coming and knowing they could not stop it. In diaries, soldiers admitted things they would never say aloud. That their hands shook. That their breathing felt shallow. That sometimes they hoped to be wounded, not badly enough to die but badly enough to leave the front. One of the most painful emotions repeated across diary entries was guilt. Survivors' guilt appeared again and again. Soldiers wrote about watching friends die, and then feeling ashamed for being alive. Some questioned whether survival was earned or random. A soldier could write in one line about relief at surviving the day, and in the next about hatred for himself for feeling that relief. These thoughts were rarely shared with others. They lived only on paper. Diaries also reveal how fear changed behavior. Some soldiers became overly cautious. Others became reckless. Several American diary entries describe men who volunteered for dangerous tasks simply to end the waiting. Better to face fear once, they wrote, than to live with it endlessly. German soldiers sometimes wrote about emotional numbness. After repeated losses, fear was replaced by emptiness, a feeling that nothing could shock them anymore. But even numbness had a cost. Many entries describe moments when fear returned suddenly, triggered by sound, darkness, or memory. A distant explosion, a scream, a smell. These moments reminded soldiers that fear had not disappeared. It had only been buried. Another recurring theme was honesty about doubt. Soldiers questioned orders. They questioned leadership. They questioned the purpose of certain actions. These doubts were rarely political in diaries. They were practical and emotional. Why was this position worth holding? Why was this patrol necessary? Writing these questions down did not mean disobedience. It meant confusion and exhaustion. Diaries also reveal how soldiers tried to cope. Some wrote routines to maintain control. Some focused on small details, meals, weather, letters received. Others avoided writing about combat altogether, as if silence on the page could reduce its power. For many, writing itself was survival. The diary became a private space where a soldier could remain human, where fear could exist without judgment, where guilt could be admitted without consequence. Unlike medals or commendations, diaries recorded weakness without punishment. That is why these writings feel so different from official accounts. They are fragmented, emotional, sometimes contradictory. A soldier could write that he felt brave in the morning and terrified at night, that he hated the enemy and pitied them moments later. These contradictions were not lies. They were honest reflections of a mind under strain. By 1944 and 1945, many diaries grew shorter. Entries became less frequent. Words were limited to simple statements. Still alive. Another bad day. Too tired to write. Silence itself became a form of expression. These pages show us that fear was not a failure of courage. It was a constant companion of survival. And guilt was not weakness. It was the cost of living through something that others did not. In the next section, we will look at another layer revealed in these diaries. How soldiers wrote about what they did, what they witnessed, and the moral weight that followed them long after the fighting stopped. Diaries did not only record fear, they recorded memory. And memory, once written down, was harder to escape. Many World War II soldiers used their diaries to describe what they witnessed in combat. These were not polished stories. They were fragments, moments frozen in words. Some entries are detailed. Others are painfully brief. A sentence might describe an entire day of fighting. Another might stop mid-thought, as if the writer could not continue. American soldiers, particularly during heavy fighting in 1944, often wrote about the shock of seeing death up close for the first time. Training had spoken of objectives and targets. Diaries spoke of bodies, silence, and confusion. Some soldiers wrote that the first time they fired their weapon at another human being, they felt nothing. Others wrote that they felt too much. There was no single reaction. German soldiers, especially on the Eastern Front after 1942, recorded scenes that were difficult to process. They wrote about destruction that seemed endless, about villages reduced to silence, about the sense that violence had become routine. What appears again and again in diaries is hesitation. Not every soldier wanted to write about what they did. Some avoided it entirely. Others wrote indirectly, using vague language or focusing on surroundings rather than actions. This avoidance itself tells a story. When soldiers did write about killing, the tone was rarely celebratory. More often it was distant, as if the writer were describing someone else. A diary might note an engagement, then move immediately to weather or food. This shift was not accidental. It was a way to regain control. Several diary entries describe moments when soldiers questioned themselves afterward. Not during combat, but after. In quiet moments when the noise faded. They asked questions without answers. Did I have a choice? Would it have been different if I had waited? Why do I remember his face? These questions were not philosophical. They were personal. Diaries also reveal how soldiers struggled with moral boundaries. Some wrote about orders that felt wrong. Others wrote about actions they did not recognize themselves in. In American diaries, there are moments of shock at how quickly violence became normal. How firing a weapon stopped feeling extraordinary. German diaries sometimes express a different conflict, a sense of being trapped between duty and doubt. Continuing to fight not out of belief, but because stopping felt impossible. These thoughts rarely appeared in official records. Diaries allowed soldiers to express discomfort without consequences. No punishment. No judgment. But writing did not erase memory. Many soldiers described how images returned at night. Faces. Sounds. Specific moments replayed without warning. Some entries mention dreams that felt more real than waking life. Others describe avoiding sleep altogether. Over time, diaries show a change in language. Early entries often contain longer descriptions. Later ones become sparse, as if words themselves were becoming heavy. By 1945, many diaries stopped entirely. Not because the war was over, but because the writer no longer knew what to say. For those who survived, the diary became a record they could not undo. A written memory that outlived the moment. After the war, some soldiers destroyed their diaries. Others locked them away. A few allowed them to be read years later. These decisions mattered. They reflect how deeply personal these writings were. Diaries did not offer clean conclusions. They did not explain whether actions were justified. They did not resolve guilt or doubt. They simply recorded that something happened, and that the person who wrote it had to live with it. This is why these diaries are so powerful. They do not tell us what soldiers were supposed to feel. They show us what they actually felt. Conflicted. Uncertain. Changed. In the next section, we will look at what happened after the fighting stopped. How soldiers wrote about returning home. About silence. And about carrying these memories into a world that no longer wanted to hear them. For many soldiers, the war did not end when the fighting stopped. When World War II officially ended in 1945, millions of men were suddenly expected to return to ordinary life. The noise faded. The uniforms were removed. The weapons were left behind. But the diaries did not end there. Some soldiers continued writing after the war. Others returned to old pages, adding new thoughts in the margins. What they wrote reveals a difficult truth. Peace did not bring immediate relief. Many diary entries from late 1945 and 1946 describe confusion rather than celebration. Soldiers wrote about standing in familiar streets that felt unfamiliar, about conversations that felt shallow, about smiles that required effort. They were home but not whole. American soldiers often wrote about the pressure to appear grateful. The war was over. They had survived. People expected happiness. But diaries tell a quieter story. Some wrote that they felt disconnected from those around them. That everyday problems felt unreal compared to what they had seen. That they struggled to explain themselves and eventually stopped trying. German soldiers returning to a defeated country wrote about a different silence. Many avoided discussing the war altogether. Not because they had nothing to say, but because there was no safe place to say it. Diaries became heavier after the war. Earlier entries focused on fear of death. Later ones focused on fear of memory. Soldiers described sudden reactions to sound. Doors slamming. Fireworks. Engines backfiring. Moments that returned them to the battlefield without warning. Sleep remained difficult. Some diaries mention nights spent awake, replaying scenes they wished they could forget. Others mention avoiding sleep entirely. What makes these entries especially striking is their honesty about isolation. Many soldiers wrote that they felt alone even among family. Loved ones wanted stories of victory or heroism. Diaries held stories of loss, confusion, and regret. Some soldiers felt guilty for surviving when others did not. That guilt did not disappear with time. In some cases, it grew stronger. Diaries also reveal how soldiers struggled to reconcile who they had been during the war with who they were expected to be afterward. A man who had made life-and-death decisions was suddenly expected to worry about work, money, and routine. The transition felt abrupt and unfair. Several entries describe a desire to forget and an equal fear of forgetting. To forget felt like betrayal. To remember felt unbearable. For some, writing became a way to hold onto meaning. If the experiences were written down, they could not be dismissed. Others stopped writing because it hurt too much. These diaries also challenged the idea that time automatically heals. Some soldiers wrote years later that the memories had not faded. They had simply become quieter. That quiet was deceptive. Without the structure of war, many soldiers felt unanchored. The discipline that had kept them focused in combat was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Diaries became a space where soldiers could admit that returning home was not a simple victory. They wrote about anger that appeared without warning, about numbness, about feeling older than their years. These writings were not meant to accuse or explain. They were attempts to understand. By the late 1940s, many diaries ended permanently. Not because the writers had found peace, but because they had said all they could. What remains in these pages is not closure. It is continuity. A reminder that war does not stay contained within its years. It moves forward through memory. In the final section, we will look at why these diaries still matter today. Why reading words never meant to be read is not an act of intrusion, but an act of understanding. World War II diaries were never written to teach lessons. They were written to survive moments. And yet, decades later, they have become some of the most honest records of the war. These diaries matter not because they reveal secrets, but because they reveal people. In official histories, soldiers are often reduced to numbers, units, and movements. Diaries restore individuality. They give us voices instead of statistics. What makes these writings especially important is their lack of intention. The soldiers who wrote them did not know how the war would end. They did not know which side would be remembered as victorious or defeated. They did not write with hindsight. They wrote in the present. This gives their words a rare kind of truth. When a soldier wrote, "I'm afraid," he was not trying to explain fear. He was trying to endure it. When another wrote, "I don't know why I'm still alive," he was not making a philosophical statement. He was struggling to understand survival. These moments cannot be recreated after the fact. That is why diaries feel different from memoirs written years later. Memoirs carry reflection. Diaries carry immediacy. They capture confusion before it becomes interpretation. Across different nations and fronts, diary entries echo each other in surprising ways. American, German, British, and Soviet soldiers often described similar emotions: fear, exhaustion, doubt, and longing for normalcy. These similarities remind us that suffering was not limited by uniform or language. At the same time, diaries force us to confront uncomfortable realities. They show that soldiers were capable of compassion and cruelty, that they could feel pride one moment and regret the next. This complexity challenges simplified narratives of good and evil, not by excusing actions, but by explaining human behavior under extreme conditions. Some critics argue that reading these diaries is invasive, that private thoughts should remain private. This concern deserves respect. But history is not preserved only through official permission. It is preserved through memory. Most diaries were shared by families, not seized. They were offered as a way to understand what their fathers, brothers, or sons had carried silently. Reading them is not about judgment. It is about listening. These writings help explain why so many veterans struggled after the war, why silence followed celebration, why returning home was not the end of the story. They also serve as a warning. Not a warning about weapons or strategies, but about the human cost hidden behind them. Wars are often remembered for their turning points and victories. Diaries remind us of their endurance. They show how long fear lasts, how memory lingers, how survival itself can feel heavy. For younger generations, these diaries offer something rare. Not lessons taught from above, but experiences shared from below. They ask us to slow down, to look past headlines, to recognize that history was lived one day at a time. In an age of fast information and simplified narratives, these pages resist speed. They require patience and empathy. That is why they still matter. Not because they shock us, but because they connect us. They remind us that the past was not inevitable. It was uncertain, fragile, human. And in those quiet moments when soldiers wrote words they never expected anyone to read, they left behind something more powerful than strategy or victory. They left behind truth. Unfiltered, unpolished, and deeply human. In the final section, we will return to where we began, to the idea of privacy, and to why respecting these voices is as important as remembering them. The diaries of World War II soldiers were never meant to last. They were written on fragile paper, often with borrowed pencils, sometimes in moments stolen from exhaustion. Many were hidden in packs, stuffed into pockets, or tucked beneath mattresses. Some were destroyed deliberately. Others survived by accident. Yet decades later, these words remain. Not because they were preserved carefully, but because they were written honestly. What gives these diaries their power is not what they reveal about battles or strategy. It is what they reveal about silence. During the war, soldiers lived inside systems that demanded strength. They were expected to endure, to obey, to move forward. There was little room for vulnerability. Diaries became the only place where weakness was allowed, where fear did not need to be hidden, where doubt did not need to be justified. When soldiers wrote in these pages, they were not recording history. They were trying to stay human. That is why reading these diaries today feels different from reading official records. There is no attempt to persuade, no effort to impress, only moments. A few lines written after a bad day, a sentence cut short by exhaustion, a page filled with thoughts that never found an ending. These fragments resist easy interpretation. They do not offer heroes or villains. They do not explain the war in neat terms. Instead, they show us uncertainty. They show us how ordinary people experienced extraordinary violence. Not as symbols, but as individuals. For historians, these diaries are invaluable. They fill the gaps left by reports and statistics. But their value goes beyond research. They remind us that history is not only made by decisions at the top. It is lived by people at the bottom. People who felt fear before they felt courage. People who questioned orders. People who carried memories they could not share. There is a responsibility that comes with reading these words. Not to sensationalize them. Not to judge them. But to listen. To acknowledge that the past was not composed of simple choices or clear outcomes. It was messy, confusing, painful, and deeply human. These diaries also challenge us to reconsider how we remember war. Commemorations often focus on victory and sacrifice. Diaries focus on endurance. They show us that survival itself was an achievement, and sometimes a burden. As time passes and living memory fades, these writings become quieter. But quiet does not mean unimportant. In fact, it may be where truth lives most clearly. When we read words that were never meant to be read, we are not uncovering secrets. We are being invited into a moment of honesty. A moment when a soldier, alone with his thoughts, chose to write instead of remain silent. That choice matters, because it reminds us that behind every uniform was a person trying to make sense of the world as it collapsed around them. And as long as these words survive, the people who wrote them are not reduced to dates or numbers. They remain voices. Quiet voices, but real ones. And in listening to them, we do more than remember a war. We remember the humanity that endured inside it.